for Arendelle.
There was the Knock, the water horse, which was the product of 8 months of hard work. There were several challenges to creating a creature made out of water that also needed to be true to the look of an actual horse. Because it has no pupils, or real eyes for that matter, it's a lot harder to convey the character's emotions, so the animators relied on the Knock's ears. They made the ears point to wherever the Knock was looking, while also conveying its mood. If the ears point back, the horse is angry. If the ears point to the rider, they respect the rider. But before the animators could control its emotions, they had to figure out how to control the water it's made of. While the water in Moana had some personality, it was nowhere near this complex. In early tests, there was way too much water coming off the mane and tail, which animators described as looking like a fire hydrant. They eventually controlled it to the point where it looked more like a gentle waterfall. The Knock also had to look like it was part of the ocean, so they looked at elements of the actual ocean, like mist and spray, which forms at the end of the mane and tail as it moves. Staying true to the water form also required making the Knock different from an actual horse in some ways, like the way it moved. When the Knock is running on water, you can see the hooves sort of break and stretch, which is apparent if you slow down this clip of the Knock running on a wave. To get a sense of actual horses, animators studied horse anatomy, met with a horse trainer, and actually rode horses. It was important not just to capture the look of horses, but the weight of them, so Elsa could really get a sense of this creature's power.
Did it seem magical?
Yes. Now back up while I deal with this crook here.
What did you call me?
Hey, okay, ow! One of the big turning points in Frozen 2 happens in the Dark Sea. This is where the Knock scene takes place. Animating realistic water is not easy, and animators used what they'd learned on previous Disney films to make it work. For the Dark Sea, they were largely inspired by Reynisfjara, a black sand beach on the southern coast of Iceland. Nailing this scene required a lot of coordination between the animation team and the visual effects team, and since she was going to be walking on the simulation, it all had to match up perfectly. The animators also mastered some factors about water that you'd never think of, like how sand looks when it gets wet after getting hit by a wave. Disney Animation developed another simulation engine for Moana called Splash, which gave them a lot of practice making the open seas. Through this, they could calculate, for example, what it would look like for a wave to break. For Moana, the challenge was trying to make the water calm, but for Frozen 2, it was important to make the waves big and overpowering while still seeming real. You can see those realistic waves directly here, as Elsa stares them down on the beach before running in head-on. While these look incredibly realistic, the animators actually pulled back so they didn't look too real. Sure, they now had the tools to make it look like actual water, but sometimes it's more important that your animation looks realistic for the animated fantasy world you're creating, not necessarily for our world. New characters here that posed an even bigger challenge for the animators, and that's because they aren't human or creature, but the elements. Now, on most computer animated movies, the visual effects and animation teams work separately. The animators create the characters, and the visual effects team adds computer simulations like weather effects or how a piece of clothing will drape over a character. But what do you do when the effects are your characters? There is no better example of this than Gale, who's a gust of wind. Wind would usually be a visual effects simulation added in later on in the process, but here it's a character, so they had to create a new program for the animators just for this, called Swoop. Usually, you just see the end result of wind, but this time we see it as a whole character. To get this basically invisible character right, a wind rig ran alongside given scenes, and they were able to manipulate its size and add simulations to this that helped determine Gale's speed and path. Here's Gale blowing into a house and pushing Sven out the door. Creating Gale also required working closely with the environments team on elements such as the leaves that get swept up by Gale. For instance, when Olaf is singing his When I Am Older solo, piles of leaves needed to be placed on the ground for Gale to pick up. At one point early in the design process, they contemplated having Gale take the form of the other characters, mimicking their shapes with debris. And animators had to think about whether at any given moment Gale was supposed to be playful or dangerous. But let's not act like this wasn't a fun challenge. Along with studying physics, the animators went skydiving for inspiration. The skydiving experience certainly shows if you look at this shot of Bruni being swept up by the wind. He has his arms and legs out in skydiving form.